Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our first Writing Wednesday of the new year. It's a new year, new look, new Writing Wednesday. We're very excited. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from the circulation desk at Union West. I'm going to throw it over to Kris. Kris, if you want to introduce yourself. I kind of already did it, but
I'm Kris, and you may recognize me from running around Monroe, hopefully from the circulation desk, but I pop up pretty much anywhere. And moving on.
And I'm Tino, also from Monroe, and I'm kind of also everywhere all of the time.
All right. Yeah, so like Allie mentioned, we are starting a brand new Writing Wednesday, and we have reformatted everything. As much as we love the news and we could spend hours upon hours talking about it, we want to get down to the nitty gritty and start focusing on the parts of writing that really matter. And we're going to start off with a super fun topic this day. So fancy. That's what happens when you watch Bridgerton. How to write the ultimate villain. What? I don't know about you guys, but I love villains. They're my favorite.
They often outshine protagonists for me, in my humble opinion.
I think the older that you get, the more you appreciate the nuances that villains have as opposed to protagonists, which, I don't know, sometimes come across as like one note good, you know?
Fair.
The motives of villains is always more interesting.
Yeah, the hero motive is pretty simple. Save the day. Save yourself, save your family, but the villain, their backstory.
There's so many reasons to destroy the world,
I for one, appreciate when the lines between protagonist and antagonist and villain and hero, I appreciate some blurred lines in that sense. When we've got a little bit of both. We've got some confused loyalties as to who we're rooting for.
Yes, I love it. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into it. So we're easily using the word villain as an overarching term, but when it comes down to it, some of these characters just aren't bad enough to be villains, are they? So a villain tends to remain as the bad guy. They oppose the good guy. That's all there is to it. They're motivated by evil. They're malicious. Just everything about them turns your stomach. That is the nastiness that is the villain. As opposed to the antagonist, which I like to think of as a little bug in your ear the entire story, just buzzing away. And you're like, you are making this not as enjoyable as it should be. How do I flick you out of here? How do you guys look at the terms?
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Allie.
I generally think, pretty much like you were saying, I think the villain, while the terms are generally used somewhat interchangeably in conversation, I think that villains tend to, I feel like in my mind, the way that I'm differentiating it is villains know they're villains and they're pretty intentional about what they're doing and their motivations, whereas antagonists are just opposing forces to the protagonist. And if you switch to the perspectives, you might see that the antagonist in this story is the protagonist of that story and is just trying to achieve their own ends. So I think that's kind of how I think about it.
I don't know that I really thought about it that deeply until we did this presentation. I think I also just kind of like equated antagonist and villain. I guess I didn't think of villain as sort of a literary category of a character. It just, like, antagonist, it sounds very like English 101, right? So like that, I recognize that as a writing term. But villain to me, it's just such like common vernacular that I didn't really think of it as there being a distinction between the two. I just thought of antagonist being more technical. But then when we started doing this presentation, we were looking into the details of it. It got me thinking about the different antagonists and villains that we've had in stories and stuff, and sort of which ones I find more interesting was the point that I thought was the most interesting about doing this presentation as well, was finding that antagonists to me tend to be more interesting characters because there's more depth to them, right? Like the purity of the evil of the villain is it drives a plot point, but it doesn't make for necessarily a particularly nuanced or interesting character, or really necessarily anyone that you can really like empathize with.
Right. Yeah, the antagonist, excuse me, does tend to be like a more sympathetic character, even if you recognize them as not being the quote unquote good guy in the story. You're not completely separated from them. You're not necessarily rooting for them to, like, receive justice or punishment. No, that tends to be a very villain-esque trait. Only they are the ones that you're like, there's no coming back for this guy. So let's just throw him in a hole and leave him there forever. Fair?
Yeah, seems like justice.
I think Eddie Izzard once said of Pol Pot, you just put him in a room with only like
don't go in the room.
And don't go in the room. Just don't go in the room. It's that simple. All right, so let's start with the antagonists. Let's break them down. Let's look at our sympathetic villains, which is, I feel like it's an easier term, sympathetic villains. Ah, yes. Everybody loves a bad boy, right? Yeah, I know. I definitely credit the bully a little bit to our society. This whole idea that if they bully you, they secretly like you makes it really easy for you to love a bully in a story, because you're like, well, they're only doing that out of their misguided desires. Those poor babies.
Early gaslighting.
The bully, I think, is one of the characters or the antagonists that were introduced to pretty early on in literature. I mean, Draco Malfoy is kind of he's a pillar of the bully antagonist idea. But I think kind of like you were saying, Kris, I think the reason that we do tend to empathize with the bully sometimes is because we know that if we think about it for a little while, we know that bullies bully out of reason. There's something that comes from somewhere. There's some sort of inner hurt that's manifesting in an aggressive way here. And so we're more inclined to kind of poke at it and figure out, well, what's happening here? Let's peel back some layers and figure out what's going on. And in the case of Draco Malfoy, I think he's a good indication of kind of realizing that there's a little bit more, and that he's not as one-dimensional as he might have appeared, especially in earlier books. So I think it's an interesting archetype to investigate.
Well, and I also think that once going off of that, once we sort of get to the level of maturity where we realize that about villains, that there's like some history that motivated their present behavior, it's almost like we're rooting for them a little bit, right? Like we want them to get better. We want them to be redeemed, to like realize the wrongs of their ways and like make a flip and then, suddenly become a good guy. And I think that once we're old enough as readers to recognize that there's a deeper history, then they become much more sympathetic, because we know that there's an opportunity for redemption. Like they don't have to become villains. They can sort of, there's a fork in the road.
Right. And when it comes to writing the bully, it's probably really one of the easiest the antagonist to kind of write, because I think we all have met a bully in our lives. Even if you were the most popular person in school, you had a bully. Everybody has a bully. And it's real easy to
might have been the bully.
Yeah, you might have been the bully. So it's very easy to pull from real life experience when you're writing this kind of antagonist. It's more of a down to earth antagonist. Um, and we'll see the
Your
difference.
casual antagonist.
Yeah, he's just a casual antagonist, darling. Casual, totally.
Gateway antagonist.
Gateway, and I like that. Gateway antagonist. All right, so the mirror. Now, Allie, you kind of mentioned this earlier when you were talking about how you love stories where protagonist and antagonist kind of like move through each other. It's more fluid. So, do you want to talk a little bit about the mirror self?
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this idea where, the antagonist and protagonist kind of mirror. There are overlaps. I think another one that we talked about, or that was noted when we were, researching a few articles on the topic, was also Professor Moriarty in Sherlock. And I think that that's another, it's just so fascinating to see when the evils and the goods are kind of, they mirror each other. They're reflections of each other in a way, and they highlight the foils in each other so well. And I mean, Gollum is Gollum is obviously a really good representation of that. And that Gollum is the mirror within himself, Smeagol and Gollum. And I think what's sad is when you kind of feel for Gollum, which I can't help but feel for Gollum. And he's just kind of he's the pathetic, and I feel like he's there. The mirror and the corrupted one, which we'll get to a little bit later, they kind of have a tendency to overlap as well. So what do you guys think of this mirror and how it kind of can meld into other personalities?
It was hard to put the mirror up as an antagonist because I like to think that the mirror is a trait more than anything else. It's one of those things that you can see in a lot of villains. You mentioned Moriarty. I feel like this is more of a trait of Moriarty, and I think that has to do with the hero. When you have a hero that needs to be challenged and their greatest challenge is their self, this becomes a very good trait. One of my favorite examples I saw of this was Nega Scott from Scott Pilgrim versus the World, because he has to fight the 7 deadly X's, and he goes through and he fights all them, and then, oh wait, there's one more. It's actually you. You have to fight yourself now. But I mean, yeah, I think the mirror and the corrupted definitely got a lot of stuff in common with each other. I agree with that.
Yeah, this was another one of those categories that I hadn't really thought all that much about. I definitely think it's interesting thinking of Gollum as the mirror, both to Frodo and then also to himself. And because it is such a through line of the story that, this is what Frodo could turn into or could have turned into. And that really gave me a lot of perspective in sort of reflecting back on what I had read.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, the henchman. And I put Boba Fett up because, he's the ultimate henchman, right? He's just there to do a job. He's got no pony in this fight at all. He's just there to do a job and get paid.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything else really to say about the henchmen, right? I mean, that's literally what they are. They're literally just tools. Which, and that's not tools in that way, but maybe also in that way. But that also makes me think of who are these people? When they go home, what do they like to eat? There's when you really sit down and think about it, when you do these sort of deep analyses of books, which every once in a while you come across, and you go over these sort of minor characters and these henchman type characters, it really makes you wonder, from the perspective of the writer, did they have anything else in mind about this character that they just didn't put on the page because it wasn't relevant, right? But like, I think it would be interesting to think, what's Boba Fett's favorite drink? You know, it that's sort of the bit that I miss. But you can't flesh that out for every character, obviously. But it just makes me
No.
think,
But it does sound like a super fun writing prompt.
right? Like, take a
Amazing.
minor character that has like no development and
Develop
write a
them.
dinner scene.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, how do you become a henchman? How do you become so devoted to an idea or a figure that you're willing to execute any level of horror or evil or antagonistic behavior for that figure or idea or leader? I think people have looked into that throughout history, and I think that's why it's an intriguing idea, is how do you I think that's why these figures, the henchman, is kind of familiar in a historical sense, but also it's an intriguing concept.
So it's fair to say that when you have an antagonist like the henchman, pretty easy to write. They pretty much take their cues from your big villain. Not too shabby. They are just kind of the ultimate one-dimensional character. Go, do this. Good job. Or bad job. That's it. Alright, the corrupted. Oh, the corrupted. I don't know, maybe instead of the bully, this is the one I feel the most sympathy for. Because they start out so good. You're like, oh man, they're totally going to be their best friend. I ship this. Oh, no, just kidding. Just kidding, I don't.
Well, and the thing with the corrupted too, right, is that they're often enough in the course of reading about them, part of what makes them interesting is that you can see where they're coming from, like how they ended up in this situation that they're in. And, sometimes it's, they sort of had a tendency towards evils and they just kind of fell into it. It was all good. And then sometimes they really were good people. They were put in bad situations. And you were like, would I have been any different had I been in that same situation? And I like that nuance that they're very human.
I feel like in the corrupted, in this sense, when we're looking at the corrupted storyline, we're almost watching the character. We kind of do in these stories see how the character became maybe a henchman or maybe the mirror. How did they get there? How did they become the opposite, the foil to what they used to be, or these other characters? And I think the corrupted, what I think about is, I was trying to think about some antagonists that I like. For instance, the mage, if you've read Carry On, thinking about these kind of zealot characters,
Right.
have really good intentions. They really want to do something, or they used to have really good intentions, and what their drive was towards something positive. And along the way, they started making exceptions, and they started making excuses for their behavior until they became something that they wouldn't even recognize initially. And so I think those are characters that are always really interesting to me and interesting to write, is how do you, kind of like Tino, like you were saying, how do you fall down the rabbit hole and get so far down the rabbit hole that you can't climb back out again? It's an interesting exercise in writing and in reading, I think, to try and see how that happens and how easy it is for that to transpire.
All right, the criminal. I love the criminal. And I love the example that I have here of the criminal. It's the character of Trudy from the Happen Leonard series. This is a great series about two guys who are really just trying to lay low, and everything in their life keeps putting them into these horrible criminal situations, and nothing leads them down the path more than Hap's ex-wife Trudy. Trudy is the pivotal criminal because all she wants to do is have a better life, and she's willing to go after it however she can. It doesn't make her a bad guy necessarily, because she's not. She's one of the favorite characters that I've read in the series. She's funny, she's caring, she's just selfish and willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead in life.
Yeah, and I think that this is another one of those, much like the corrupted, and in some ways, I guess you can make the argument that criminals are corrupted in a way, from the sort of stereotypical good guy path, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the things that I really like about the criminals, is that people commit crimes for lots of different reasons, and I think a lot of it has to do with history and background and perspective. And there's a lot, I mean, truly, there's a lot of situations, both in literature and in real life, where, you see something illegal happening and you're just kind of like, I might have done that too,
Yeah.
and like you recognize that it's against the law, but you're also like,
I don't know. If I knew I could get away with it, would I do it?
right? Or even in like more tragic situations, like, your family's starving and you gotta break into a bakery, Jean Valjean style.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't really make Jean Valjean an antagonist. Where would the story go?
Right. No, it's truly.
Well, because I haven't mentioned it yet, and I can't get through a Writing Wednesday video without talking about Bardugo and/or Six of Crows.
That's right.
It's fine. So
Cast.
I mean, we love this cast of characters, and they're all criminals.
Oh yeah.
They're all criminals. Everyone, the good guys, the bad guys, they're all criminals. And it's interesting to see that perspective of how criminals look at other criminals and how they're all like drawing the lines between each other. And it's so interesting to see from their point of view and to watch them justify their behavior.
Sure.
And to be a reader and to think, yeah, sure. I mean, they're doing all these horrible things, but you're totally with them. You're totally rooting for them. And it's so fascinating. And they're such fascinating characters to write because, yeah, like you both said, you can get the reader on your side. Well, normally we're like, the criminals are bad, which, yes, kids, criminals are
bad.
Yes. But unless they're in a fantasy series and they're all fun and lovely,
then they're usually great. They're wonderful.
A great ensemble.
But it's like a very 2010s thing too, right? Like I feel like that whole decade was really a renaissance for the criminal. Because you also had like a load of TV shows, like Sons of Anarchy was blowing up. And that was the thing that fascinated me the most about Sons of Anarchy, is that if you sat there and you watched it, if you walked in on that series halfway through and you'd never seen it before, you're like, why are they doing that? That is horrible. And then whoever's watching it is like, no, it totally makes sense. They're doing this because this happened and that happened. So of course they had to do it. And like, if you watched it like from the beginning, you're just like Ali said, you're with them. Like you also want to torture those people. And I think that there's something really psychologically fascinating about that.
I mean, there's something psychologically fascinating, I think, about our nation's obsession with the criminal, because you bring up Sons of Anarchy, but I'm thinking The Sopranos, The Godfather, like Scarface. These have hit so hard in the zeitgeist of our culture. We kind of, even further back, Robin Hood. He's still a criminal, guys. We understand he was doing it for good. Still a criminal. I also would like to just point this out, that the Fox version is the greatest Robin Hood ever.
Is there another?
Thank you.
Well, there's Russell Crowe.
No, there's not.
No.
He's a fox of a different kind.
Asking. I was just informing the general public. Like, I think we definitely romanticize the criminal, and I think we've made it into this very alluring concept, which it can be. So it's very, very interesting. Very.
Yeah, definitely one of the more fun antagonists to write, I think, because you do get to kind of toe that line between, are they bad? Are they really bad? Think about it. What would you do?
Yeah. Well, what makes a person bad? I think that's what you have to consider when you're writing any sort of antagonistic character or villain, is what makes them bad and what makes anyone bad. And is anyone really bad, or do they just do bad things? And how do you, like, that's something you totally have to decide for yourself as a writer, and decide where you're going to draw the line, and if you're going to draw the line at all, or if it's just going to be kind of a hazy little blur.
Yes.
But also stay in school, kids.
Stay in school.
Please do.
All right, so this is where we're starting to move into the spectrum that becomes villainy when we find the authoritarian. And we know tons of examples of authoritarians throughout literature and, of course, television and movies and such. But in literature, the interesting thing about the authoritarian is they don't tend to be like the focal point of the story. They tend to be a setting more than anything else. Like in 1984, Big Brother's always around, but Big Brother doesn't necessarily have a face. You know, we do get a face of Dolores Umbridge and Harry Potter.
And what a face.
Oh, what a face. Like a toad it was. But, you know, it just it's very interesting to see the authoritarian antagonist show up in the story.
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of a similar idea. My most prominent, when I think of it, I think of President Snow of the Hunger Games, and I think he kind of has the same. He's always there. We always know he's around, and he's the ultimate threat. He's the big bad. But we don't really get close to him until the story is closing in and everything is coming to a head. And I think that it's an interesting, that's scary, you know? I think that's why the authoritarian is something to be feared, because while they're everywhere, they're also nowhere. So you don't know, but they're always present in the back of the protagonist's mind, so they're always present in the back of the reader's mind, and we're always waiting for that person. It reminds me of for the youngins, I'm thinking about Fire Lord Ozai in Avatar Last Airbender. He's the same kind of thing. He doesn't really show up until the very end, but he's the threat. We know he's the threat, and so that kind of blankets the whole story with this tension and this unease.
Yeah, I also think that, you know, they're terrifying. I mean, they're so recognizable, right? Like they're such a tangible part of like our life, and I think definitely from the Western perspective, where we have this sort of, you know, hoorah for freedom and, you know, individuality and stuff like that. I think that such that's also very much in the zeitgeist of you know, liberal democracies, but also just on a small scale. Like the thing that came to mind when I was doing these slides was, you know, like that's your high school principal. You know, if you were unfortunate enough to really have that jerk high school principal, right? But that they're sort of all pervasive, yet you don't see them.
Yeah.
And they have the authority to do whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, at least from your perspective, like as a student, you're not thinking about the laws that restrict them from doing things, but you know, they have that complete control. And I think that as we get older and we see them in like political figures and stuff like that, it always remains a really sort of raw fear, because we might have experienced that injustice at the hand of authority, and we can sort of in our mind project that out to the really extreme. And I think it becomes very relatable, and you all of a sudden feel very deeply that you're in that authoritarian regime that the characters are feeling as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out for people who are interested in writing the authoritarian into their stories, another trait that tends to exist is the use of symbols. And you can see this today. You know, if you look at certain political groups, there's always a symbol that's associated with them. And that symbol itself is used as a way to incite fear in some people. And you see it in books as well. You know, even something as simple as like the red light on a camera coming on can be enough to invoke a fear with a authoritarian setting taking place. So this tends to be like a really nasty antagonist, but it also you can't throw them directly into the evil end, because once again, their intentions may have originally started out pretty good. They may have thought they were saving the world, and maybe the authoritarian experienced corruption. Like, that's the interesting thing about these genres and these the way that they're sorted out is they can overlap with each other over and over again.
Yeah. So that's all we have for this session. We're going to be back next week with part 2 of the presentation, and we're going to talk about those big, bad, evil people, the villains. See you next week.